Steve Harvey stopped filming when a sick mother collapsed, and what happened next shocked the world. In a world where entertainment always comes first, where ratings and schedules matter more than anything else, one man made a choice that would change everything. He abandoned the show. He abandoned the script. He chose humanity over the camera. But the real shock isn't just that he stopped. It's what his decision revealed about compassion, about what we've forgotten, and about the power of one moment to transform an entire culture. Stick around, because this story will restore your faith in humanity in ways you never expected. The studio was alive, that electric hum that only exists in live television. The kind of energy that makes your heart race, that makes you feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself. Hundreds of audience members sat in perfectly arranged rows, their phones already out, already recording, already imagining the moment they'd tell their friends they were here. The lights were blinding, the music was pumping, and somewhere in that sea of faces was a woman who had no idea that her life was about to change forever. Her name was Margaret. She was 58 years old, a grandmother of 3, and she had saved for 2 years to be in this audience. 2 years of skipping vacations, of choosing the cheaper option at the grocery store, of working extra shifts at the hospital where she'd spent the last 30 years as a nurse. She knew every cardiac rhythm, every warning sign of a heart in distress. She could read an EKG like other people read novels. But today, sitting in that audience, waiting for Steve Harvey to walk on stage, she ignored every single warning her body was screaming at her. The chest tightness had started 3 weeks ago. Just a flutter, really. Nothing serious. She'd felt it before. Stress, probably. Too much caffeine. She was a nurse. She knew the difference between real danger and her own anxiety. She'd scheduled a doctor's appointment for next month. Next month was plenty of time. But as she sat in that studio, as the anticipation built to a fever pitch, that flutter became something else. It became pressure. It became weight. It became the sensation of something tightening around her ribs, like invisible hands squeezing harder and harder. Next to her sat her daughter, Claire, who kept glancing over with that look that said, "Mom, are you okay?" Margaret kept smiling. She kept nodding. She kept her eyes forward on the stage where, any second now, Steve Harvey would emerge and make this the best day of her life. She wasn't going to miss this. She wasn't going to be that person who got sick at the perfect moment. She was going to sit here. She was going to laugh. She was going to feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The music swelled. The audience erupted. And Steve Harvey walked out onto that stage like he owned the world, because in that moment, he did. He was smiling that megawatt smile, waving to the crowd, soaking in the applause like it was sunshine. He was in complete control. He was a master of his domain. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was born to do. Margaret's hands gripped the armrest. The pressure in her chest intensified. She told herself it was excitement. She told herself it was the rush of finally being here, finally living this dream. She didn't tell herself the truth, that something inside her was breaking down, that her body was sending out distress signals she was too stubborn, too determined, too afraid to acknowledge. Steve launched into his opening monologue. The audience laughed on cue. Margaret laughed too, but it felt different now. It felt forced. It felt like her body was betraying her in real time. And she was choosing to ignore it because the alternative, admitting that she needed to leave, that she needed help, that she couldn't do this, was unthinkable. Her daughter reached over and squeezed her hand. "You good?" Claire whispered. "Perfect," Margaret whispered back. "I'm perfect." But she wasn't perfect. She was anything but perfect. She was a woman on the edge of a cliff, and she was about to step off. The show continued. Jokes landed. The audience roared. Steve moved through his material with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times. He was untouchable. He was invincible. He was completely unaware that in his audience, in row G, seat 14, a woman's heart was beginning to fail. Margaret's vision started to blur at the edges. The studio lights seemed brighter, almost blinding. The sounds around her became muffled, like she was underwater. She could hear her daughter's voice, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from very far away. She tried to focus on Steve, tried to anchor herself to the moment she'd waited 2 years for. But her body was no longer listening to her mind. Just a few more minutes, she thought desperately. Just get through the next segment. You can do this. But her body had other plans. What Margaret didn't know was that within the next 5 minutes, everything would stop. And Steve Harvey would make a choice that would define him forever. The moment came without warning. 1 second, Margaret was sitting in her chair, gripping the armrest, trying to hold onto consciousness. The next second, the world tilted. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't a slow fade to black like in the movies. It was sudden and violent and absolute. The pressure in her chest exploded into something worse. Something that felt like her entire body was collapsing inward. Her breath caught in her throat. Her vision tunneled. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, everything went dark. She slumped forward. For a split second, the people around her didn't understand what they were seeing. Margaret's body simply folded, her head dropping toward her lap, her arms going limp. Claire's brain couldn't process it fast enough. One moment her mother was sitting upright, and the next moment she was gone. "Mom?" Claire's voice cracked. "Mom!" She grabbed Margaret's shoulders, trying to pull her back up, trying to make sense of what was happening. But Margaret was a dead weight in her hands. Her eyes were closed. Her face was gray. She wasn't responding. "Help! Someone help!" Claire's scream cut through the studio like a knife. For just a fraction of a second, the show continued. Steve was mid-joke, mid-gesture, completely unaware that something catastrophic was unfolding in his audience. The band kept playing. The audience kept laughing. The machinery of entertainment ground forward, oblivious to the emergency erupting 30 feet away. But then the sound registered. Claire's desperate cry, the sudden commotion in the audience, the gasps from people nearby who suddenly realized that this wasn't part of the show. This was real. This was terrifying. This was a woman collapsing. Steve's words died in his throat. Mid-sentence, mid-breath, his entire body went rigid. He could feel the shift in the room's energy, that sudden, unmistakable moment when something breaks. When the carefully constructed illusion of entertainment shatters against the reality of human crisis. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check with producers. He didn't look at the cameras or think about the show or consider the ratings or the schedule. In that instant, every instinct he had as a human being overrode every professional consideration. He moved. "Stop the music," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Cut the music. Now." The band stopped. The audience fell silent. And in that silence, there was only one sound. Claire's desperate pleas for help. Steve was already moving off the stage. He wasn't running. He was moving with purpose, with the kind of focus that comes from knowing that every second matters. He'd seen emergencies before. He'd been around enough people to recognize the look of genuine crisis. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that this woman needed help immediately. He reached Margaret's row and dropped to his knees beside her. Up close, the severity of the situation was undeniable. Margaret's skin was ashen. Her lips had a bluish tinge. She wasn't breathing normally. Her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. Her pulse was erratic. Steve's years of living, of being around people, of understanding human vulnerability, kicked in. He didn't panic. He assessed. He acted. "Is she breathing?" he asked Claire, his voice calm and authoritative. "I don't know. I don't know. Mom, come on, Mom." Claire was sobbing, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold her mother up. Steve checked Margaret's airway, tilting her head back slightly to ensure nothing was blocking her breathing. He placed his fingers on her neck, feeling for a pulse. It was there, but it was wrong. Too fast, too irregular, like her heart was misfiring. "Someone call 911, he shouted to the crew. "Now, tell them, we have a medical emergency. Woman, approximately 60, possible cardiac event. Get an ambulance here immediately." The studio erupted into controlled chaos. Producers were barking orders into headsets. Security was clearing a path. Audience members were standing up, their phones out, recording. Because even in a moment of human crisis, the impulse to document and share was too strong to resist. But Steve wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about Margaret, about the fact that she was unconscious, about the fact that her heart was struggling, about the fact that without immediate intervention, this woman might not wake up. "Margaret," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Margaret, can you hear me? My name is Steve. You're going to be okay. Help is coming." There was no response. Margaret's body remained limp, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Steve positioned her on her side, the recovery position. The same position he'd learned years ago, the same position that keeps an unconscious person's airway open. He stayed close to her, monitoring her breathing, monitoring her pulse, ready to perform CPR if her heart stopped completely. Claire was on her knees beside them, tears streaming down her face, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her mother, the woman who had raised her, who had worked 30 years as a nurse, who had saved so hard for this moment, lying unconscious on the floor of a television studio. "Come on, Mom," Claire whispered. "Come on, come on, come on." The minutes felt like hours. Every second stretched into an eternity. The studio, which moments before had been filled with laughter and music and the manufactured joy of entertainment, had transformed into something else entirely. It had become a place where life hung in the balance, where a woman's fate was being decided in real time, where one man's decision to abandon the show and choose humanity had become the only thing that mattered. In the distance, barely audible over the silence of the stunned audience, came the sound that everyone was waiting for. Sirens. But what Steve did in those next crucial seconds, before the paramedics even arrived, would be the difference between Margaret living and Margaret dying. The sirens drew closer, echoing through the studio, slicing through the tension like a hot knife through butter. Claire was still kneeling beside her mother, her hands shaking uncontrollably, desperate for a sign that Margaret was still with them. Steve remained by her side, his presence a steadying force amid the chaos. He kept his focus on Margaret, whispering encouragements, willing her to respond. "Hang in there, Margaret. Help is almost here," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. He knew that staying calm was crucial, not just for himself, but for Claire, who was clearly terrified. Moments felt like lifetimes. Finally, the doors at the back of the studio burst open, and two paramedics rushed in, their faces serious and focused. They were a well-oiled machine, One of them immediately assessed the situation, while the other called for the necessary equipment. "Step back, please," one of the paramedics instructed, gently but firmly. Steve moved back, allowing the professionals to take over as they knelt beside Margaret. He felt a sense of helplessness wash over him, but he also felt relief. Help had arrived. "Is she breathing?" the lead paramedic asked, kneeling next to Margaret. Steve nodded, explaining quickly, "She was responsive a moment ago. Her pulse is weak and erratic." He could see the paramedic's eyes sharpen, assessing the situation. The paramedics moved in tandem, one checking Margaret's airway while the other readied a defibrillator. They worked with practiced precision, their movements fluid and efficient. Claire watched, her heart racing, as they slipped a pulse oximeter onto Margaret's finger, their expressions serious as they monitored the readings. "Margaret, can you hear me?" the paramedic called, gently shaking her shoulder. There was no response. "We need to get her stable." The lead paramedic glanced at his partner. "Let's get her on the stretcher. We'll start IV fluids on the way." They carefully maneuvered Margaret onto the stretcher, taking care to keep her aligned and supported. Claire felt a surge of fear. What if it was too late? What if they couldn't save her? "Mom," Claire cried out, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please wake up." As they wheeled Margaret toward the exit, Steve felt a surge of determination. He followed closely, not wanting to let go of this moment. He could see the urgency in the paramedics' movements, the way they communicated in quick, efficient bursts. "Stay with us, Margaret," he urged, his voice steady. "You're going to be okay." Once outside, the bright lights of the ambulance flooded the area, illuminating the darkening sky. The paramedics swiftly loaded Margaret into the back of the ambulance, and Steve held his breath as he stepped back. He wanted to jump in, to continue supporting Claire and Margaret. But he knew that the professionals had it under control. "Claire, get in," Steve called out. "You need to be with your mom." Claire nodded, her face a mask of panic and determination, and climbed into the ambulance. The doors swung shut behind her as the paramedics began their work inside. Steve stood by, watching through the windows, heart pounding as he could see the frantic activity within. The lead paramedic began administering CPR, pushing down on Margaret's chest with precision and rhythm. The other paramedic started an IV, the beeping of machines surrounding them like a chorus of urgency. "Let's get her stabilized," the lead paramedic instructed. "We need to get her heart rate back up." As the minutes ticked by, Steve could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had witnessed laughter and joy moments ago, and now the scene had transformed into one of life and death. The reality of it all hit him hard. This was no longer just a show. It was about a woman fighting for her life. From behind the glass, he could see Claire's face, a mix of fear and hope. She held her mother's hand tightly, whispering encouragements. The connection between them was palpable, a bond of love that transcended the chaos around them. Finally, the lead paramedic turned to Steve, his expression serious but determined. "We need to get her to the hospital. We're going to intubate her for transport. Stay close and keep her calm." Steve nodded, his heart racing. He had stepped into this moment as a television host, but now he was just a man, a witness to a life hanging by a thread, and he was determined to see it through. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens blared to life, Steve felt a surge of resolve. He had chosen to abandon the show for humanity, and now he would do everything in his power to ensure that Margaret made it through. But what awaited them at the hospital would test not only Margaret's strength, but also the bonds of family, friendship, and the true essence of humanity. The ambulance sped through the streets, sirens wailing, lights flashing like an urgent heartbeat. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with tension. Claire sat beside her mother, holding Margaret's hand as the paramedics worked feverishly to stabilize her. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor punctuated the air, a constant reminder of the precariousness of life. "Stay with me, Mom," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She brushed Margaret's hair back from her forehead, her touch gentle yet desperate. "You're going to be okay. Just keep fighting." The lead paramedic glanced up, his expression focused but reassuring. "We're doing everything we can. Just keep talking to her. Your voice can help her fight." As the ambulance hurtled toward the hospital, Claire felt both terrified and hopeful. She could see the determination etched on the faces of the paramedics, and it gave her a glimmer of faith. But the uncertainty was overwhelming. What if they couldn't save her? What if she lost her mother today? "Mom, please," Claire pleaded, her voice cracking. "I need you to wake up. I can't do this without you." When they arrived at the hospital, the scene was a whirlwind of activity. The ambulance doors swung open, and the paramedics quickly wheeled Margaret out on the stretcher, Claire following closely behind. They rushed through the emergency department, passing nurses and doctors who moved with purpose, ready to intervene in a life-or-death situation. "Coming through! Cardiac emergency!" the lead paramedic shouted, and the hospital staff sprang into action. They guided the stretcher into a treatment bay, and Claire was momentarily halted at the threshold. "Wait, I need to be with her," Claire cried out, panic rising in her chest. "Just a moment, please," a nurse replied, gently but firmly. "We need to assess her condition first." Claire stood frozen, her heart racing as she watched Margaret being surrounded by a team of medical professionals. They worked quickly, each member knowing their role in the critical effort to save her life. Claire could see the defibrillator, the IV lines, the masks, everything that represented both hope and fear. "Let's get her intubated," the doctor instructed. "We need to secure her airway. She's not breathing adequately on her own." Claire felt her stomach drop as she heard those words. They were doing everything they could, but the severity of her mother's condition felt like a punch to the gut. She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers, but all she could do was stand there, helpless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a nurse turned to her. "You can come in now. She needs you." Claire rushed into the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a seat beside Margaret, grasping her hand tightly. "I'm here, Mom. I'm right here," she said, her voice trembling. The team continued their work around her, each person focused and efficient. The doctor monitored the heart rate, while another nurse adjusted the IV drip. Claire watched in awe, feeling both admiration for the medical team and fear for her mother's life. "Margaret, can you hear me?" the doctor asked, though he knew there would be no response. The question was more for Claire's benefit, a way to keep the connection alive. Claire leaned closer, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mom, I love you. You're the strongest person I know. Please come back to me. We need you." The doctor looked up from the monitors, his expression serious. "We're going to do everything we can, but she's in critical condition. We need to get her stabilized before we can assess the next steps." Claire nodded, trying to absorb the weight of his words. She felt a mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude for the professionals who were fighting for her mother's life, and fear for the unknown that lay ahead. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity, until finally the doctor stepped back, hands on his hips, assessing the situation. "We've stabilized her for now. We're going to move her to ICU for closer monitoring." Claire felt a rush of relief. They had taken the first step. "Can I stay with her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," the doctor replied. "We'll have a bed ready in just a moment. You can sit with her until we transfer her." As the medical team prepared to move Margaret, Claire held her mother's hand tightly, unwilling to let go. She knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for Margaret. "You're going to get through this, Mom," she said, more to reassure herself than anything. "I promise I won't leave your side." Finally, they transferred Margaret to a gurney and wheeled her out of the room. Claire walked alongside, her heart pounding in her chest. They moved through the hospital corridors, passing other patients and families, each dealing with their own stories of hope and fear. When they arrived at the ICU, Claire was struck by the stark reality of the situation. The room was quiet, filled with the soft beeping of monitors and the faint hum of machinery. It felt both sterile and surreal, a place where lives were fought for, where moments hung in the balance. The nurses began to set up Margaret's bed, and Claire settled into a chair beside her. She felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The fear, the uncertainty, it was almost too much to bear. But she also felt a flicker of hope. Margaret was a fighter. She had always been. "Just hold on, Mom," Claire whispered, squeezing her mother's hand. "We're going to get through this together." But the road ahead would not be easy. As Margaret fought for her life, Claire would discover the depths of her own strength and the true meaning of family, love, and resilience. The ICU was a place suspended between life and death. Machines hummed their constant rhythm. Monitors beeped their vital statistics, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in a cold, clinical glow. Claire sat in the uncomfortable chair beside Margaret's bed, watching her mother's chest rise and fall with the mechanical assistance of the ventilator. It was a sight that both comforted and terrified her. Hours had passed since they arrived at the hospital. The initial crisis had been managed, but the uncertainty remained. The doctors had explained that Margaret had suffered a massive myocardial infarction, a heart attack so severe that it had caused her to lose consciousness. They had managed to stabilize her, but the damage to her heart was significant. "We won't know the full extent of the damage for another 24 to 48 hours, the cardiologist had told Claire, his voice gentle but grave. "We're monitoring her closely. The next few hours are critical." Claire had nodded, understanding the implications. Critical. That word hung over her like a dark cloud. She hadn't left Margaret's side. She had called her brother, Thomas, and her sister, Rebecca, and they were both on their way to the hospital. She had also called her 3 children, Margaret's grandchildren, to let them know what had happened. The conversations had been difficult, filled with tears and prayers, and the kind of desperate hope that comes when facing the possibility of losing someone you love. But there was something else weighing on Claire's mind, something that had been gnawing at her since they arrived at the hospital. Steve Harvey, the man who had abandoned his show, who had dropped to his knees in the audience, who had stayed with them until the ambulance arrived. She didn't even know if he had left the studio or if he was still there, dealing with the aftermath of what had happened. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the news. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media and news outlets. Steve Harvey pauses show for medical emergency. Television host chooses humanity over entertainment. Cardiac patient saved by quick action at live studio taping. The articles were filled with praise for Steve's actions, with speculation about what had happened, with interviews from audience members who had witnessed the event. But there was something else too. A sense of awe, of respect, of recognition that, in a world often driven by ratings and profit margins, one man had chosen to do the right thing. Claire felt a surge of gratitude towards Steve. He had been there when it mattered most. He had acted without hesitation, without thought for the consequences to his show or his career. He had simply been human. She made a decision. She pulled up her phone and began typing a message to the studio's contact information. She didn't know if it would reach Steve, but she had to try. "My name is Claire Morrison. My mother, Margaret, collapsed during the taping of the Steve Harvey show today. I wanted to reach out and thank Steve for his quick thinking and compassion. He stayed with us, he kept my mother calm, and he made sure help arrived immediately. I don't know if he'll ever see this message, but I wanted him to know that what he did mattered. It saved my mother's life." She hit send and felt a small weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the night wore on, Claire dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable chair, her hand never leaving her mother's. She dreamed of the studio, of the moment Margaret collapsed, of the fear and chaos that had followed. She woke several times, checking the monitors, reassuring herself that Margaret was still breathing, that her heart was still beating. Around 3 a.m., a nurse came in to check on Margaret's vitals and adjust her medications. Her name was Sandra, and she had a kind face and gentle hands. She smiled at Claire with a kind of understanding that only comes from years of working in the ICU, from witnessing families at their most vulnerable. "How are you holding up?" Sandra asked, her voice soft so as not to disturb Margaret. "I'm okay," Claire replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "How is she? Is she going to be okay?" Sandra checked the monitors, her expression thoughtful. "Her vitals are stable. That's a good sign. The next 24 hours will tell us a lot. But your mother is a fighter. I can tell by looking at her. She's not going to give up." Claire felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to believe that, wanted to hold on to that hope. "She's a nurse," Claire said. "She spent her whole life helping people. She deserves to get a second chance." Sandra nodded, understanding the weight of that statement. "Then we'll do everything we can to give her one." As dawn broke over the city, casting long shadows across the ICU, Claire remained vigilant. She held her mother's hand, whispering prayers and memories, telling her stories of her grandchildren and the life that was waiting for her on the other side of this crisis. And somewhere in the depths of unconsciousness, somewhere in the darkness where Margaret's mind was struggling to find its way back to the light, she heard her daughter's voice. It was a lifeline, a beacon, a reason to fight. By mid-morning, Thomas and Rebecca had arrived at the hospital. They rushed into the ICU, their faces etched with worry and fear. Claire stood up to embrace them, and for a moment, the three siblings held each other, drawing strength from their bond. "How is she?" Thomas asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Stable," Claire replied. "The doctors say the next 24 hours are critical, but she's holding on." Rebecca moved to Margaret's bedside, taking her mother's hand gently. "Come on, Mom," she whispered. "We need you. Your grandchildren need you. You've got so much life left to live." The three of them settled into a vigil. They took turns sitting beside Margaret, holding her hand, talking to her, willing her to come back to them. They shared memories, told stories, laughed through their tears. And they waited. Retention hook. But what none of them knew was that Steve Harvey had not forgotten about Margaret. In fact, he was about to make a decision that would bring their stories together in ways they could never have imagined.